Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on how REDD supports corporate climate goals. I'm David Antonioli. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Verra, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Julie Baruti, our Senior Director of Forest Carbon Innovation. Thank you all for joining. I know that you all have curious to know what we'll talk about today. We have a lot to unpack, but we also have the ability for you guys to ask questions. Just as a quick housekeeping matter, if I can get the next slide, please. We'll go through a set of presentations and deck that will cover these various topics. But please feel free to be adding your questions throughout in the Q&A function on the webinar, and then at the end, Julie will collate and kind of put those together, and then come back online so that she'll then ask them, and then we'll answer them between the two of us. So I look forward to this next hour. I hope it will be informative and helpful for you all. We really want to cover three main topics. One is our role in the volunteer market, what we do, and how we do it. Our response to the recent criticism in the Guardian and Die Zeit newspapers, and then why REDD is so important for climate action. So thanks again for joining. And can I get the next slide, please? So Verra's role in the volunteer market is as a standard-setting organization. We are a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we're a mission-driven organization designed to develop, manage green standards or certification programs that help drive finance to activities that are good for the world. You probably all mostly know our Verified Carbon Standard, or the VCS program. That is our flagship program, and the program that has issued, the large majority of credits currently in the voluntary carbon market. We also have, as part of the Verified Carbon Standard, the jurisdictional and nested REDD framework. That's a framework that enables governments to use carbon finance to protect forests. I call it a subset. It's kind of a separate set of rules because it applies to governments. It's somewhat different, but it really is part of the VCS program. We also manage a number of other sustainable development certification programs: the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standards, the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, both of which allow projects to demonstrate that they are generating positive, sustainable development, community, and biodiversity benefits for communities and for biodiversity generally. And oftentimes these get labeled onto carbon credits that are issued under the Verified Carbon Standard. So the VCS program, we issue VCUs, Verified Carbon Units, and oftentimes when projects want to demonstrate that those projects are doing, in addition to the carbon reductions or removals, they also can label those credits with CCB, Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standards, or SDVISTA, the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, to demonstrate in an audited, transparent way that these projects are having these additional benefits that aren't accounted for by simply the carbon reduction or removal. We also manage the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard, which is meant to prevent and keep plastic from flowing into the environment. And we're very excited about that too. But I think it's important to talk about how our standards are designed and how we work. And on the left of the slide, you'll see a diagram that sets out the main functions of what we do. So we have a standard, that's the core set of rules that applies to all projects. And then we have accounting methodologies that apply to individual projects based on their specific circumstances. If you can imagine that a project that's capturing landfill gas might need to capture different data than a project that's protecting forests. So the accounting methodologies allow you to look into every single different project type and have a clear set of procedures and rules for the data you have to gather, how you demonstrate additionality, and so forth. And so those are the basic set of rules, and those change and evolve over time. I'm going to get into that with some examples. That's a core element of what we do. We can't, we need to, bring that back, thanks. We need to make sure that that our work evolves along with new scientific evidence, new best practices, a better understanding of the world, and so forth. So all of these rules are constantly being updated, and you'll have some clear examples about that, particularly with REDD. We rely on third-party auditors to do a lot of the work to make sure that the projects are meeting the requirements of the VCS program or our various programs. And we have, strict rules that govern and oversee the work of the auditors. The independent auditing part of what we do is very, very important to making sure that the work has integrity. And we also manage a registry system, which is a publicly available platform that enables anybody to look at the details of every single project. Kind of at a high level, a registry is designed to avoid double counting and ensure transparency. And so you can go to our registry and find everything you always wanted to know about any project registered under the VCS, CCB, SD Vista, Plastic. And this gives you, for example, the description of the projects, the auditor's reports, the representations that the project developers make, and so on and so forth. So it's a really, quite a bit of information that's available for the public to see, and we think is very important to ensure transparency. Next slide, please. So our response to the various articles really kind of falls into two categories. If I can get the next slide, please. Kind of at a most fundamental level, you were being very transparent about everything that we do, the data that we have, we want to make sure that there's a level of transparency that's very important about everything that we do. You will have seen a few pieces already on our website, one which we published immediately after the Guardian and Desight stories broke, but then one that we published earlier this week, which was we went into more detail. We'll be publishing more, and I'll tell you more about that. But our response to these articles, which we take very seriously because it's an accusation about the integrity of Verra certified REDD credits, really are twofold. There's some concerns that we have about the studies themselves that are referenced in the articles, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But there's also some significant concerns about the reporting done about these articles, which is essentially extrapolating from these articles to make outlandish claims about the quality of the credits that we certify. Next slide, please. So there's various issues with the scientific studies. Let me just say, first of all, that we welcome scientific studies. This is very important for everybody to understand better what's going on. But I think that there's some important limitations to the studies that have been used to criticize our work. The first one is that they employ overly simplistic tools that ignore local circumstances. What these studies have done is they've taken, they've kind of found data to support the creation of a different reference area. And so I'll just explain a little bit about how REDD works. In order to have part of the fundamental piece of REDD for REDD is that you have to find an area that is representative of what would happen in your project area. That's what we call finding a reference area. And that, as you can imagine, has to follow a serious and rigorous process, criteria, procedures, so that a project selects an area that is relevant to its area. And that is really, really important. That's a fundamental piece of how REDD works, because that's where you're comparing what you're going to protect. And it's counterfactual. And it's part of REDD. It's one of the reasons this hasn't been done for so long, but we decided to do it because we thought it was a credible and thoughtful way of making sure that we help drive project carbon finance to help protect forests. But what these studies do is they create their own counterfactuals based on a desk study and a series of criteria that aren't necessarily reflective of the local circumstances. I'll give you two examples. One of them is forest type. So one of the studies may find an alternative reference area that's a very different forest type. They also could find a reference area that has very different socioeconomic drivers. Now, if you start to wonder why these are being used, that's a good question, because ultimately you've got to have the same project type, the same forest area, and you've got to have the same types of socioeconomic circumstances that would drive deforestation to be able to have a credible reference. The problem with these studies is that they're coming at it from a top-down approach, whereas our approach for finding a credible reference area is built on bottom-up understanding of local circumstances. So essentially, these studies are comparing apples to oranges. I don't want to discount them outright because there's some valuable lessons one can draw, but they can't be used for assessing the validity of a particular project, especially because they're done at scale and they're trying to choose as many reference areas as they can for for a project, but that's very difficult. And the whole point of carbon finance is driving finance to the very area where it's happening, to where deforestation is happening. I think they also, at least the West et al. Study uses an inappropriate data set. They rely heavily on Global Forest Watch data, which is a fantastic tool for looking at at forest loss over time, but it's limited use. It has limited use for assessing deforestation rates, and this is recognized by Global Forest Watch itself and others. And the conclusions are inconsistent. The studies draw different conclusions on the same projects. So you start to wonder, well, if this study says that it's a good project and this one says it's not, well, then you already know that there's some disparity, and we actually see this play out. And in fact, one of the studies studied, the Guizar-Coutinho study, was actually positive about REDD+ and showed that the initial wave of REDD+ projects were effective at reducing forest loss. So we're conducting our own review of these studies, and we'll publish our findings shortly. But I think that there's some important limitations that one can take already from the work that's been done to try to apply it to this. And if I can get the next slide, this one is a good example. One of the studies says that this project didn't do anything about deforestation. One of the other studies says that it does. So already there, you've got an example. But if you look at this, I find this a great example. This is courtesy of Biofílica, who's a developer in Brazil, and this is their Manoa REDD project. It's project 1571. If you want to find out about it, go to our registry, click in, project ID 1571. You can find out everything you wanted to know about this project. And in the middle there, in the cross grid, is the project area. And around it, in the red, orange, gray areas, are deforestation that has happened before 2012, 2013 to 2017, and then to 2022. And I think it's pretty evident here that this project's doing a pretty good job at stopping deforestation, but for deforestation rates are coming right up to its border, and they're keeping the forest standing. This is a great example of how understanding the local circumstances and understanding the drivers of deforestation help you understand the validity of a project. But this is a great example, again, of how the two studies had very different conclusions about it. And I think that's worth pointing out because, yeah, that's going to happen when you have this top-down approach. Next slide, please. Another very serious concern, perhaps even more serious, because I think we recognize the value of scientific study, is that there's some significant issues with the reporting of these studies. First of all, they combined the findings from 3 studies and kind of put them all together and drew these big conclusions. So they overstated the number of projects analyzed. And there's double counting of the same project. It's one-sided reporting. They focus exclusively on a few studies, which does not do justice to the wide range of opinions on this topic. You'd expect that a respected newspaper would look at different opinions and report on that. They also invented an arbitrary index called the implied credit worth, which relies on West et al.'s top-down artificial modeling, and used it to judge the value of credits from the worthiness of each project. This is a whole cloth construct meant to support preconceived conclusions. There's a couple of additional considerations. West et al., the second paper has not yet been published in the scientific journal. And they also position us as a provider of credits, which is inaccurate. As I mentioned before, we're a standard setting body. We write rules and procedures, projects have to follow them, and there's a whole ecosystem of stakeholders and entities that make for a voluntary carbon market. But we don't provide the credits. We simply review the project documentation, we push back when we need to, and we approve when they're good. So as a general conclusion, we find that the reporting is grossly misleading, and that it misuses science to create sensational headlines. We've submitted additional requests for corrections and are hopeful that these changes will be incorporated. Next slide, please. There has been quite a bit of support for our work from a number of organizations out there, making the case that that REDD is really important, that these studies aren't necessarily accurate, and so forth. And I invite you to look at these. These are pretty powerful statements. There's others as well. LinkedIn is full of people standing behind us, and we appreciate that. But this is a pretty serious set of allegations that we take very seriously. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why REDD is so important for climate action. Next slide, please. So why does it matter? And just to be clear on the definitions here, so REDD without the plus stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and the plus stands for the conservation, sustainable management of forest, and enhancement of forest stocks in developing countries. And the plus was added years ago when people realized that it wasn't just about stopping deforestation, but a lot of times projects and activities to conserve forests had to include enhancements or forest planting and restoration and sustainable management of forests. So that's where the plus comes from. For the purposes of this discussion, we're going to focus exclusively on REDD, because that's really where the question comes around relating to the baseline, which I mentioned before, requires a counterfactual. I think it's important to note that we need forests to reach 1.5 degrees. Global deforestation and forest degradation accounts for up to 20% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to stop it. In addition to the fact that losing forest means we lose precious biodiversity. So there's a real threat to many of the forests in the world, and REDD is a credible, thoughtful, and powerful tool that can be used to stop that deforestation. But we need to drive finance to forests. And in the end, I think that REDD fundamentally changes the economic calculus and ends up valuing standing forests. Right now, if you think about it, there's nobody going around saying, hey, I'll pay you to protect that tree. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's people saying, I'll pay you to chop it down because I want to, pull out timber. I want to, mine for minerals, oil and gas. I can also, destroy it to produce agricultural production. So there's a lot of economic drivers that we've built in our society that really, prefer to have trees dead than alive. And REDD counterbalances that. So with REDD, someone who's on the edge of a forest can now actually say, let's see, someone's going to pay me to chop it down and I can get a short-term gain, or I can actually turn to REDD and derive some revenues from the standing forest, keeping it alive for a longer term. That's a pretty powerful concept. And that's fundamentally what REDD is trying to do. Is it perfect? No, we admit that, but this is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to figure out how we can drive finance to conserve these precious forests by providing a lifeline and providing a value that's something that will value the trees standing. Next one, please. So how's REDD evolving? This is, this is pretty critical because, as I mentioned before when I showed this diagram on the left, our rules are constantly under review and development. And this is critical if we're going to be up to date and follow the latest science, the best practices, and so forth. So we've done a number of things, and I'll talk about them here, in particular to our program, but also to our REDD rules. So the first one is shorter baseline periods. Last year, we decided, and kind of after, again, researching the science, understanding best practices, et cetera, we concluded that the baseline periods needed to be shortened. So what do I mean by that? When we first embarked on this journey 10 years ago, we concluded after, reviewing the literature that you could set a baseline and it could last for 10 years. So every 10 years, you had to review and revise your baseline. That worked for a while, but over time, science has shown us that actually you need to revise your baseline on a shorter period because circumstances change, and those have an impact, particularly in this case, on what the pressures are on the forest. So what we've done is we've shortened that from 10 years to 6. So now all projects now have to review their baselines every 6 years, not every 10. And that's a program-wide change. So if you look on the left, right, that's a change to that yellow part on the standard. That's kind of all projects having this particular circumstance have to shorten their baseline period. The next one about consolidating methodologies has to do with the lower part of that diagram, the accounting methodologies. And so, again, when we started this process and kind of, figuring out how we could make REDD work, we purposefully created or enabled the creation of several accounting methodologies, because nobody had ever put pen to paper to create a proper accounting methodology for REDD. And so we thought that it was good to be able to enable a variety of different options and methods to be able to achieve that. And that's what happened. And we think that was very good because it generated a lot of activity and a lot of insights to how the system works. Now, several years in, we've gathered all those lessons, and we believe we can create a single unified methodology. And that's what we're moving to. All of those methodologies will become a single unified methodology. We consulted on it, I think last year, and we're shooting to have it published, at the in the middle of this year. So that's a really important element, which will also address something which we accept, that there's confusion in the market. This project uses this methodology, this other project uses this other methodology. We accept that creates confusion. And that's one of the reasons we also wanted to consolidate the methodologies. So that's what we're doing. We think it's a really important step to making sure that the system works and then can scale with confidence. We're also, the third point is that we're allocating the basic construct for the new methodology is going to be based on a jurisdictional baseline. I talked before about creating a project baseline where you found a reference area. Well, another thing we've learned is that we've always been kind of looking to get there, but it's been kind of the holy grail of REDD. It's like, how do you actually make projects work with a jurisdictional framework? And the way, but when we first started this journey, again, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, nobody knew what a jurisdictional baseline looked like. There were no examples. There were data gaps. There were methodological, gaps, and so nobody really knew what they looked like. But now we've got good examples of what a real jurisdictional baseline looks like. So now we're transitioning our methodology to relying on a single jurisdictional baseline that applies to the entire jurisdiction, and we will allocate that jurisdiction down to individual projects. So first, it ensures that there's alignment across the entire jurisdiction. It makes sure that the numbers add up. And we think this is a very, very powerful element of how this work goes forward. But also, it starts to integrate the project level activities with the jurisdictional efforts and help support governments develop jurisdictional programs, which again is kind of the holy grail of REDD, if you can integrate project activities with government programs. And that's where we can reach forest conservation at scale. And so those are two elements, the ones in the middle related to the accounting methodologies in particular. And then the final one is we're embarking on a very purposeful journey on incorporating DMRV, digital measurement, reporting, and verification, into all of our methodologies. There's a lot of new technology out there, remote sensing, satellite imagery, LiDAR. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff, blockchain, and we created a working group, and we're starting to kind of identify ways in which you can use these tools to both simplify the data gathering process, enhance the robustness of the verification, and make the process more streamlined. So we're looking forward to that. All these four, I think, are going to be really, really helpful so that we can see REDD scale and grow towards the future. You see below two quick highlights from our website, from announcements. And the reason I wanted to have these is to show that we've been talking about this and working on this for several years. As early as January 2020, we've been working on this. Is when we first started to kind of really make public that we were doing this. A lot of people ask us, well, why does it take so long? Well, it does take a while to understand what we do. And again, everything that we've done has been in the public eye. So you can follow all of our announcements since then to understand what we've been doing. We've consulted on requirements. We've improved some of the program requirements. We've been working together with jurisdictional framework, which I mentioned before, which relates to this. And so we keep, you'll see this as we go through, but it does take time, and it does require some diligence to make sure that we figured out that we can bring in the proper lessons and come up with a mechanism that really works. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for current projects? And we get this question a lot. So first one is that new rules will be mandatory for all REDD projects. All REDD projects will have to use the new methodologies at some point. It does mean we stand behind all the credits that we've issued. I think importantly is that our rules and our procedures are just that. They're a set of rules and procedures that projects have to follow. It's not someone's opinion. It's a rule and procedure that you have to follow. And that's what a certification system is all about. So we stand behind the credits that we've issued because all of the projects have followed the rules and the procedures. I appreciate and we understand that there may be different opinions on individual projects, but ultimately they followed our procedures and that's why we stand behind them. At the same time, we have a large and very experienced team working on reviewing every single proposal for a project or verification that comes through the door. So we're confident that we are applying the diligence necessary to give the market confidence that the credits are real. Now, again, there will be a transition. We believe that there's a concept called procedural fairness, where you can't just, tell everybody, oh, all that stuff, all that old stuff is no good. You got to use the new one. We are saying you've got to use the new one, but there's a transition. And this is something that's very common to governments, for example, in regulatory settings. Next slide, please. So I think, the experience to date indicates that REDD has generated some very positive results. I mean, at the very core of REDD is stopping or reducing deforestation. So it's been effective at stopping logging, mining, legal and illegal, agricultural production. It's giving the trees a fighting chance to address and kind of counter the economic incentive to chop them down. And REDD has also allowed the provision of the sustainable development benefits across a number of factors. So income, right? The sale of carbon credits generates income so that communities can actually thrive with the forest standing. And they use that income to hire local forest rangers, support education, healthcare. One of the key things with REDD is that in order to develop a REDD project, you have to have title to the land or title to the carbon. That means you have to have the title in the first place. So REDD has actually helped, hundreds, if not thousands of people actually gain tenure for the land which they live on, which is really important. And I know I've been to projects where, this was an issue. People wanted to develop the project. They couldn't find the title, and they went to the records and figured it out and got the title and were able to develop the project. That's very powerful. That's very empowering for local communities wanting to be proper stewards of the land. And then, of course, there's a lot of important other financing that plays out in respect of REDD. Ultimately, I think it's important to consider that most REDD projects are in many ways development projects. If you were to take a fence and just fence out an area and say, okay, everybody stay out, this is the forest we're going to protect, you'd have huge leakage, which is the idea that drivers of deforestation are going to go next door. And that's exactly what would happen, right? But REDD projects, in order to be effective, they've got to figure out how the economic calculus that plays on everybody's mind gets shifted from chopping the tree down to keeping it alive. And that's why these are ultimately important development projects that, of course, bring the carbon benefits of stopping or reducing deforestation. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you for flipping the slides. So Julie, I'm sure you've been collecting questions, so why don't you come back on? Great, there you are. Do you want to read through some questions and take us through this next session?
Yeah, so just to get us started, we've got some questions about verification and how has a project ever failed a verification? And if it has failed, how would you find them on our registry? So as David mentioned before, our registry is a transparent database of all of the documentation about any VCS or any other Verra standard project. And there are, I can tell you that there are 43 rejected projects on the Verra registry. 41 of them are VCS standard projects. And I don't know at what point those projects got registered or were rejected. So they could have been rejected at listing. They just weren't good enough, well enough developed to be a VCS project. So it's not necessarily that they were verified or validated and then they got rejected from our system. But the way you would find those is by going to registry.verra.org and then searching by status. for projects under the VCS portal. So all that information is quite available and transparent. David, would you like to comment on the way we work with third-party validation verification bodies and how we're increasing our work in that area?
Yeah, sure. So this is a critical element of what we do, and we've working with a number of accreditation entities. So we work through the International Accreditation Forum, and we have partnerships with International Accreditation Forum members in different countries, and we're trying to build that out more because we need more auditing capacity. So our work there is working with those entities so that they can develop domestic or localized accreditation programs so that local auditors can actually apply and get approval so they can work as auditors under the VCS program. As the market grows, this will become more important, and it's actually a very important element of kind of capacity building that we think is going to be critical for addressing climate change, because those skills that people get when they're assessing climate change projects or greenhouse gas emission projects are going to be very transferable to doing company audits, footprints, et cetera, et cetera. So we're very excited about that. We're building that out. We're also helping to train the auditors, existing and new ones coming into the system. That's kind of on the support capacity building side. On the other side, we're increasing our diligence to keep the auditors accountable. So for example, if we get continuously bad documentation from an auditor, we will call their attention to it, potentially suspend them. So we have the ability to kind of keep, so we're building our ability to keep them accountable and make sure that there's proper oversight in the system.
Great. We've also got some questions about what are commonly called co-benefits of REDD projects or any kind of carbon projects, but what we believe are essential benefits to maintaining the sustainability of any carbon project, especially land use based carbon projects where there is necessary engagement by the communities. So David, could you talk about how we work with the Verra suite of standards, and then so Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, Climate Community Biodiversity Standards, and then other standards, including W+, to maintain well, I'll talk a little bit about the safeguards that our standard has in it, and then if you could talk about our partnerships with those other standards that will add on to the certification of those additional benefits or essential benefits that are not carbon related. So the VCS standard has the full suite of stakeholder engagement requirements that are drawn from the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standards for land use based projects. It also requires, as I mentioned before, the transparent reporting of all of the documentation and engagement of communities in the development of that documentation. And then there are public comment periods where anybody in the world is allowed to comment on a project document for a description for 30 days. And then the auditors take the project proponents' responses to that comment, those comments that are received during the stakeholder consultation period into account. And then we have a number of different certification standards where the benefits, the additional benefits of carbon projects can be quantified and certified even.
Yep. So to follow on that, thank you, Julie. So oftentimes, obviously, projects have to meet all those requirements as part of the VCS certification process. But oftentimes, projects want to go beyond that, and they want to demonstrate, so for example, quantifiable benefits to communities or biodiversity or health or education or income or gender equity, a number of the SDGs, of which there are 17. So projects can then use these certifications to add a label to their VCU. And so that's how it works. And that's how it works. And we support and we work with a number of different labels who are attempting to achieve different things. So the Climate Community Biodiversity Standards is generally focused on biodiversity and community benefits. The SD Vista, the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, kind of really covers all 17 SDGs, and you can identify which ones you want to report on. And then you mentioned W+, which is another really important initiative looking at it's a W+ stands for Women Plus. It's about gender equity and related issues. So it depends on what you're doing on the ground, and if you want to demonstrate your project is achieving those things, you can use these labels. I think what the reason this is really powerful is that carbon is the driver. Ultimately, people want the carbon benefit, the carbon reduction, but it can serve to drive, it can essentially serve to drive all these other impacts, especially when they are sustainable development impacts and they're helping to conserve the forest. So we opened up a consultation on labels. I think it was, when was that, Julie? I think last fall. And so we opened up a consultation where we're considering allowing further labels to be added onto VCUs. And I think this is really exciting opportunity because it could be kind of seen as a race to the top. Some people might say, hey, what if you did, X, Y, or Z? Could we have a label for that? So we're opening up a process through which people can submit individualized labels that would, essentially differentiate them from carbon credits and therefore drive a race to the top. Julie, did you want anything on the labels piece?
Nope.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to throw a challenging one at you, David. How can corporates defend REDD+ credits against all the allegations?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think you want to point them to our website and to, point out that the studies are fundamentally flawed, or that they're, I wouldn't say fundamentally flawed. I'd say that they're not fit for purpose. Because again, there's some value in what the studies have done, but they are not fit for purpose. And again, they're using, top-down desk-based studies to assess something that really needs to be done on an individualized local circumstance basis. So again, they're comparing apples and oranges. I think corporates need to stand behind the fact that they've done this on the basis of wanting to protect forests. I think one of the key things that's not been talked about, it's been alluded to, and it's certainly in part of the stories, is that people are calling corporates out for being carbon neutral, saying they're carbon neutral when they're not because they bought these credits. Well, first of all, these credits are valuable and they represent real reductions. But again, nobody has really decided what carbon neutrality is. And so I think that there's some work to be done in the market to clarify what the claims are that a company can make. And I think that's a very important work. There's two initiatives I wanted to point out. On the claim side, you've got the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. And the VCMI is designing and working through the different kind of claims that corporates can make. And I think that, transitioning or adopting those agreements, those claims, not adopting the claims, but using that as a basis for the claims that companies make, I think that would be a great thing. And it's what the VCMI is doing, is trying to say, okay, what's a legitimate claim you can make when you buy a credit? And so I think it's really important. The market's kind of in this big transition, right? So that we can know what exactly the claims are that a company can make. And then, going forward, I think, you'll want to look at initiatives like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is working to establish a basic level of quality for what counts as a real carbon credit. What they're going to do, and just for full disclosure, I sit on the board of that, but I'm a non-voting member. There's 3 positions on the board that are non-voting members that are voted on. I represent the supply side of the market. There's someone who represents the demand side of the market, and there's someone who represents intermediaries. We sit on that board to provide input and insight, but we don't have a vote on that. But I think the initiative is very important because it's trying to figure out how they can look at the work that we do at Verra and the work that Gold Standard does and the work that the Climate Action Reserve does, et cetera, what it is that ensures quality and integrity. And if you look back to that diagram I had before with the standard and the accounting methodologies and the auditors and the registry, that's pretty much how what elements or the architecture of what most programs have in some shape or fashion. The ICVCM is going to make sure that any program that it says is okay, or any credits that says okay, has the proper infrastructure and has the right approach, or has a legitimate and thoughtful approach to addressing key issues in the market. Excuse me, for credits, which is, are they additional? Is the baseline correct? Is the accounting robust? Is it on a registry? You know, all those things that go to make a real carbon credit are going to be looked at by ECDCM. And I think it's a very good process because ultimately, you know, we do need to be accountable to somebody. And I think that will ensure that accountability, and we welcome that initiative.
Thanks. So similar to the verification question, projects are meant to monitor for their entire lifetime. But if a project stops monitoring before their project lifetime is up, this questioner is asking what happens then. So we are looking into a number of projects that seem to have stopped monitoring, but we don't have any public records of projects that have done that yet. However, we are working on developing this long-term remote monitoring system so that we can address this issue for the future. And the first thing that we're going to use the long-term remote monitoring system for is project permanence and making sure that REDD projects in particular are staying their project areas after the project has stopped its activities are not being destroyed out to 100 years. So that is one of our new technology initiatives that we are working on and putting into place, hopefully for REDD projects by the end of 2023.
Yeah, I think just another thing, I think underlying that question is like, so what happens if a project stops, right, and it fails? And the system is built for that through the buffer. So let me just talk about a couple things there. Conserving forests is hard, right? I said before that most trees represent kind of short-term gain when they're cut down. And so we're trying to turn that on its head by providing a value for keeping the tree standing. But that's not going to be successful every time. And it's not going to be successful every time where you have a project. So projects are going to fail. That shouldn't come as a surprise. Or projects in some cases may not even, you know, they may not stop deforestation altogether, but they may halt it. But in some cases they may not. In some cases they may fail. So we're very aware of that. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. I think the key thing here is that we will only credit the reductions that have happened. Now it could be that a project never got off the ground and we'll never monitor. And we will never hear about that anymore. And it won't be an issue because it won't have issued credits. But there will be projects that will have issued credits. But then, you know, don't monitor because maybe they fell apart and that could happen. But our buffer is designed to account for that because the buffer is designed, you know, with assuming that there's some projects that are going to fail. So we would back out any credits that were issued backed up by the buffer so that any claims made on the back of the issued credits and the purchase credits could be legitimate. So that's a really important question. I think that element of kind of what's really happening underneath is critical because, you know, protecting forests is not easy. And this is kind of a new concept, right? You know, communities don't necessarily believe it's true. You know, there's, you know, now with reports like this, they say, gee, is this all just a scam? So it's really important that we establish the credibility of that so that people can have confidence in the system, but there are going to be failures. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and there is transparent reporting on the registry about any time a project has a reversal. They need to file documentation of that. And then we take the steps that David explained. So let's see, we have a number of questions about the new REDD methodology and how it compares to jurisdictional and nested REDD. So I'll give an overview of that, and then David, you can add anything I miss. But so jurisdictional and nested REDD is Verra's, the VCS program's specific program that is directed at governments. So that needs to have a governmental proponent, and the governmental proponent can identify how it wants individual projects, standalone projects operating, or nested projects operating in the jurisdiction to be operated. Without having a jurisdictional proponent, that's why, so in jurisdictions where there is not capacity for the government to take on that role as the jurisdictional proponent, which is the case for many governments, although many governments are increasingly getting to having the quality of data with the new technology that's emerging, having the quality data that they could be jurisdictional proponents. And we're seeing more and more trend toward jurisdictional REDD. In absence of that though, Verra has moved to say, we'll step up and be the jurisdictional, we'll develop the activity data, deforestation data at the jurisdictional level and allocate it down to each of the projects in the jurisdiction, so they are consistent with each other. And that way, we can crowdsource information from all the stakeholders in the jurisdiction, review it and make sure it meets our quality standards, and then give it back to the project proponents, who can then apply their own emission reduction factors and for their own forest area. And then they can go ahead with their project development as usual. But we think this is a really innovative approach and will resolve a lot of the issues around baseline integrity in a jurisdiction that might come up. So as David said, having 5 different methodologies makes it hard to keep up on the nuances of which projects are using which methodologies. And so let me go back. The 5 different methodologies is just complicated to manage, and also complicated for projects to understand which ones they can use. So we think that this one consolidated approach will be really positive going forward.
Great, thanks, Julie. Not much to add. You've captured all the technical stuff. I think one of the things that we're very excited about this particular approach, this new approach, is that linking it to jurisdictional baselines. The holy grail of REDD is integrating individual projects with government programs as jurisdictional programs. And this is a clear, purposeful step in that direction. And I think the reason that's important is that project-based REDD and jurisdictional REDD are different beasts in some ways. Like if you think about it, project-based REDD tends to be the purview of kind of private sector actors who have the ability to deliver resources and support in very directed ways, and even corporate buyers who like to know that they're protecting, this particular forest. And yet government efforts can be much more large scale. The government has the levers to address deforestation at scale. And that tends to be kind of more government operated, kind of a more government to government approach. Although, Art Leaf initiative has brought together some corporates to support that as well, which is great. But ultimately, they kind of speak to different audiences, and the trick is putting them together. If we can, then we can get forest conservation at scale through REDD, which would be fantastic. Is kind of where we're all headed.
So we've got some questions about the incentive that Verra has, because we charge a fee for every VCU issued. Do we have incentives to issue VCUs and to promote the issuance of VCUs? So David, how would you meet that charge?
Yeah, I mean, that's the reality of how we run the organization. Of course, there's the question about integrity and quality, right? If you're putting out a shoddy product, nobody's going to buy it. So I think ultimately our job is to ensure integrity. I think it's really important to consider that we are a nonprofit organization. So if we were paying out shares to owners of the organization, I think that would be a huge red flag, but it's not. We're a nonprofit organization. We're constituted under the laws of Washington, D.C. as a nonprofit organization. And this is no different than how other nonprofits run in a sector where you have to charge a fee. You got to have a way to be able to, for example, hire the staff to do the job, to review the projects. And so I think, that does imply that we have a clear North Star and that's always been. And it's always been my North Star to make sure that every decision that we make always has integrity at the core of it.
Thanks. To what extent do you think that the Guardian article will significantly increase interest in carbon credits from REDD and reduce the price of REDD credits? And to what strategies will Verra and its partners use to reestablish trust and interest in REDD?
Well, I don't want to speculate on price or demand. I mean, I think it's going to hurt. I mean, there's no doubt that, having this out there is not good, but I do see that a lot of people are rallying around this. A lot of people are supporting our work and the work of individual projects out there. And the work that, and applauding corporates for taking the step here. I mean, again, back to the question about what should corporates do. Let's remember that the corporates who are also under the gun here, they've made real investments in projects that are designed and delivering kind of, forest conservation. I think that's really important. And not many people recognize that nobody asked them to do that. They're doing that on a voluntary basis because they want to be good corporate citizens. And I think that a tax like this may have a short-term impact, but I kind of believe in the theory, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. So we definitely have to, fight this and push back where we can. And I think there's plenty of places where we can. And I think ultimately, the market will decide whether what we have is credible. And in the end, again, we're also transitioning to a new system. So, again, going back to the concept I mentioned before about procedural or regulatory fairness, you can't just take everything that you created in the past and throw it out in the dumpster. And that wouldn't be the right thing to do, because again, we stand behind those projects followed the procedures. They followed the rules that were established at the time with a lot of scientific input and expert input, were consulted and had a lot of stakeholder input. It just found that, we now have a different way of building that. And we think that's really important. And you know what? In 5 or 10 years, that might change as well, but that's okay. We need to embrace positive change, because if we don't, then we'll always be stuck in the past. So I think that's really important to consider.
Yeah, I agree. I think also we're getting a lot of questions about the new REDD methodology, and I just wanted to say we're going to have an announcement coming out pretty soon that gives more detail on the timeline for implementation of that methodology and the timeline of transition of projects on that methodology. So please watch this space, watch our website for more details on that. More questions related to the integrity of the voluntary carbon space. Folks are asking about how we view rating agencies and the conclusions that they draw.
Sure. So ratings agencies have, popped up because I think there's a lot of confusion in the market. Nobody really knows how to compare one credit, with another from the same program or across programs. So I get that there's a fair bit of confusion. I think that's been one of the areas where the ratings agencies have popped up. They also, I think, have come because there's now quite a bit of demand in the market. And I think that's a good sign, and we welcome that. Again, I do think that the work that the ICVCM is doing should help focus the work of the ratings agencies on really comparing credits. I mean, ultimately, there will be a set of what I think are going to be called kind of ICVCM credits in the market, and the ratings agencies will still be able to provide a lot of value comparing what the credits are like and whether providing their opinions. But ultimately, I think the work of the ICVCM will be really critical to make sure that we have a base level of performance across all the standards that are accepted within the ICVCM framework. But I get I think it's good. It's a sign that the market is growing, that there's sophistication. But I think maybe going back to my previous point, that the real value, there's a lot of real values, but one of the fundamental values of the ICVCM is that it will make it easy for new corporate entrants to enter the space. They'll know, okay, I can buy these credits. They've been vetted. I know that they're okay. And if you combine that with the VCMI work, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which is about do you have a net zero target? Are you performing against it? Are you offsetting your residual emissions? To the extent that we can get companies to be following that guideline, again, having a target, performing against it over time, meaning you're making internal reductions and offsetting the rest, then you're really supercharging climate action in a way that makes it easy for corporates. And so one of the concerns I have about, the attacks from The Guardian and others is that, in a way, they're undermining that long-term view that we could essentially put a price on carbon, because we know that governments aren't going to do it. I live here in the US, and there's no way that we're going to have a price on carbon anytime soon. And that's because, the politics are so challenging. And I don't imagine that they're easier in other parts of the world. So I think what we have now with the voluntary market is the ability to create this very easy entry point for corporates. And in a world where people start to recognize, or increasingly recognize, that climate change is a real problem, it's a massive crisis, corporates are going to be pushed to doing something about it. And I think the voluntary market can really have a lot of value in helping to provide a very clear approach through which they can engage and support climate action and become, get to that net zero state in the future. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to build here.
Great. I know we have to wrap up in just a minute, and that seemed like a really good point to wrap up on, but I have one more question that I want to throw at you, and it is, what have we learned? What have we taken away from the articles and the scientific studies? I think one thing I've taken away is just the importance of communicating that our process of continual improvement and the transparency of the process that we go through to get to where we're going, even if it can be unbearably slow at times. We are definitely dedicated to that continual improvement and not changing things too quickly for project proponents to react and for the market to react, even as we are committed to ensuring environmental integrity and that a VCU is always 1 ton of carbon.
Yeah, no, sorry. That's a great question, right? I think a couple of lessons, there's probably a lot, but I think, one of them has to do, and then we've, it's kind of gone back and said, gee, did we do the right thing? Should we have insisted on a single methodology? I think one of the lessons learned is that, and this is not just us, but kind of the sector as a whole, we've learned a lot about how you implement projects on the ground, REDD projects in particular. And that's been a really valuable, rich conversation. In fact, we've talked about maybe even doing kind of a workshop or a conference where we kind of bring together all the REDD players, right? And you get different approaches for how, different discussions around how you actually implement the project. How do you identify communities' needs? So there's a lot of learning that's happened. And I picking up on your point, Julie, I don't think we've been very good at communicating that. I think that the one of the challenges that we've had is that we've had to deal with a number of things at the time, and sometimes we focus on the priorities. And right now, the priority is assessing all the projects that are coming in the door. But the immediate priorities, again, also you're resolving issues with these attacks. But you don't always have all the resources to do everything. And maybe one lesson is, maybe we should have spent more time communicating about things. But those that we I think ultimately we have to think forward. And we can learn from the past, but we can't live there. We've got to move forward to make sure that we continue to build these markets and to provide the opportunity for corporates to engage in an easy, thoughtful manner, and also the private sector and NGOs and communities to be able to do their part. I think this is really part of a bigger ecosystem that we're very excited about. We think that the market is really important. Again, it's got to grow. These structures I mentioned before, I'll go back to them. I keep going back to them. VCMI and BICVCM will be really, really critical to providing that confidence that the market needs. And I get that the fact that the market has been in a bit of a tumult because of this and just general confusion. But I think 6 months from now, we'll have a very different conversation.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today, and please feel free to contact Verra if you have any other questions on this or related issues.
Great. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining. Have a good day.
Bye.